possible homicide, and I don't want to go there yet. We don't know for sure what happened to Nancy, but he believes it is likely someone who knew her in some way, whether that be someone who worked in her house at one point, someone she, knew from going to the grocery store. I mean, could be literally anyone in that capacity, but someone who knew her based on the statistics. And he's going to go through several different statistics and research methods that he has to try to narrow down who this person is responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. What is your profile for who this suspect could be?
At 1:47 a.m. on February 1st, 2026, the doorbell camera at Nancy Guthrie's Tucson area home disconnected. At 2:12 a.m., and the camera software detected movement. At 2:28 a.m., the app connected to her pacemaker lost contact with her phone. By the time her family realized she had not shown up for church later that morning, an 84-year-old woman who had difficulty walking, relied on daily heart medication, and lived a quiet life in the Catalina foothills was gone. Those are the official timestamps. They are cold, clinical, and brief. But inside them sits one of the most unsettling missing person cases in recent memory, because every one of those moments points to a night when something went terribly wrong inside a familiar home. If you appreciate carefully sourced, fact-first true crime storytelling, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Time in Crime. On this channel, the goal is not to force a theory where the evidence does not go, but to walk through what is documented, what is still unresolved, and why some cases continue to grip the public long after the first headlines fade. And this case, more than most, demands that kind of discipline because the facts are disturbing enough on their own. 2. Nancy Guthrie was not an anonymous headline when this story broke. She was the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the longtime co-anchor of NBC's Today, and the mother of Annie and Cameron Guthrie as well. But before the case became national news, Nancy was first a vulnerable older woman living in the Tucson area, someone the FBI would later describe as having difficulty walking, wearing a pacemaker, and needing daily medication for a heart condition. Public reporting also showed how rooted the family was in Tucson. Savannah grew up there, studied there, worked there, and returned to a city where her mother still lived. That local familiarity is one reason this case hit so hard. This did not happen in a place Nancy barely knew. It happened at home. 2. The last fully ordinary part of Nancy Guthrie's timeline happened on Saturday, January 31st. According to the timeline released publicly, she took an Uber at 5:32 p.m. to a family dinner, nearly 4.5 hours later at 9:48 p.m. She was dropped back off at her home by a family member, and the garage door opened and closed minutes later. That is the last confirmed point in the public record when Nancy was known to be safely back at the house. There is something especially haunting about that detail because it is so routine. Dinner with family, a ride home, a garage door opening in the evening. No one in that moment could have known that this quiet return would become the last ordinary chapter before the case changed forever. Then the timeline narrows. Sometime after Nancy returned home, the night shifted from normal to unknowable. At 1:47 a.m., the doorbell camera disconnected. At 2:12 a.m., the software registered movement, though investigators initially said no usable video was available because the home did not have an active monitoring subscription. At 2:28 a.m., and the pacemaker app disconnected from Nancy's phone. Those 3 times do not tell investigators everything, and law enforcement has never publicly laid out a minute-by-minute reconstruction of what happened between them. But they do something just as chilling. They create a window. They mark the span in which the house stopped feeling secure and started feeling like the center of a crime. And once those timestamps entered the public record, the case was no longer just about a missing person. It was about a night measured in digital traces and silence. The next shock came in broad daylight. At 11:56 a.m., on February 1st, after learning Nancy had not attended church, her family went to check on her. Moments later, they called 911. By 12:15 p.m., non-investigators had arrived and begun a search using drones and dogs. That sequence matters because it tells us 2 things. First, this was not a disappearance discovered by chance days later. The alarm was raised quickly. Second, the people who knew Nancy best recognized almost immediately that her absence was not normal. She had not simply failed to answer a phone call. She had broken a pattern strong enough that family moved fast, and when they got to the house, what they found only deepened the fear that this was something far worse than a medical event or an accidental wandering. Very early in the investigation, authorities indicated this was not a routine missing person case. Public reporting from the first days said investigators found signs of forced entry at Nancy Guthrie's home. A person familiar with the investigation also told the Associated Press that investigators found specific evidence inside the home showing there had been a nighttime kidnapping. Several of Nancy's personal items, including her cell phone, wallet, and car, were still there. That cluster of details is powerful because each item rules out a little more innocence from the scene. A woman in need of medication had not driven herself away. A woman whose phone remained inside had not chosen to leave with intention. A woman whose car remained at home had not simply gone out. By the time those facts became public, the case had already crossed a line from baffling to terrifying. 3 weeks later, Savannah Guthrie publicly shared more about what the family encountered that day. She said the back doors of Nancy's house were propped open and that Nancy's phone and purse were still inside. She also spoke about blood on the front doorstep and a camera that had been yanked off. In that same interview, she said the family knew immediately this was not a case of Nancy wandering away, because of the pain Nancy lived with and because the condition of the home did not make sense. Those details came from the daughter, not from a formal law enforcement briefing, so they have to be framed carefully. But they mattered because they gave the public a clearer picture of the house itself. Not a tidy mystery, but a home that looked interrupted. A home that appeared to show both disorder and force. 4. That early picture is why authorities moved so quickly to say Nancy had likely been taken against her will. By February 2nd, law enforcement was publicly saying they believed she had been kidnapped, abducted, or otherwise taken. The sheriff had also said she needed daily medication and could die without it. Reuters later reported that Sheriff Chris Nanos said Nancy had extremely limited mobility and could not have left the home unassisted, which helped explain why investigators rejected the idea that she had simply disappeared on her own. The FBI would eventually classify her as a vulnerable adult. All of that matters because in some missing person cases, authorities spend days deciding whether a disappearance is suspicious. In Nancy Guthrie's case, the evidence inside the home, her physical condition, and the timeline pushed investigators toward a criminal explanation almost immediately. And yet, for all the urgency, the first days also came with profound uncertainty. Authorities did not identify a suspect. They did not have proof of life. They did not publicly explain a motive. The sheriff said early on that they did not have credible information showing Nancy's disappearance was targeted. At the same time, he also said investigators believed she was still out there. Reuters later reported his position this way: there was no proof of life, but there was no proof of death either, and his working assumption remained that Nancy was alive. That combination created a very particular tension around the case. The public knew enough to understand that something violent or coercive had likely happened, but they still did not know who had done it, why it had happened, or whether Nancy could still be brought home safely. 3. Then the messages started. According to the public timeline, on Monday, February 2nd, Tucson television station KOLD received an email that appeared to be a ransom note. Investigators said it included a demand for money and set a deadline. More messages would follow in the days after. This development changed the public texture of the case because it introduced the possibility that Nancy had not only been taken, but was being used as leverage. That is the point where the horror of the case became impossible to soften. If the messages were genuine, someone had removed an elderly woman from her home in the middle of the night and then turned her life into a bargaining chip. If the messages were fake, then the case had become a magnet for cruelty almost immediately. Either way, the family was suddenly being forced to navigate not only fear, but communication from people claiming to control answers. Savannah Guthrie and her siblings responded publicly with a series of pleas. On February 4th, Savannah posted a video asking for proof that her mother was alive. On February 7th, she made another video directed at the possible abductors, saying the family understood the message and would pay for Nancy's return. On February 9th, she posted again, describing the family as being in an hour of desperation and saying they still believed their mother was alive. These videos became some of the most emotionally memorable parts of the case because they stripped everything down to the basics. A daughter asking for proof of life. A family saying money was not the issue. a brother and sister appearing beside her. None of it brought certainty, but it did reveal something important. The family was trying to keep the possibility of communication open while law enforcement continued chasing leads. At the same time, the messages themselves remained murky. On February 9th, the FBI said it was not aware of ongoing communication between the Guthrie family and any suspected kidnappers, despite an apparent deadline that had been discussed publicly. Later in March, Savannah clarified that some of the purported ransom notes had been fake, though she said she believed the 2 notes she and her siblings responded to were real. That detail is crucial because it shows how chaotic the information environment around this case became. Investigators were trying to save time, protect a vulnerable woman, and assess evidence. Meanwhile, the family was being pulled into a world where every message might be a lifeline or a lie. In a case already built on uncertainty, the ransom communications did not settle the picture. They made it more unstable. Thacker. On February 5th, authorities revealed one of the clearest and most painful facts in the entire case. DNA testing showed that blood found on the front porch belonged to Nancy Guthrie. That confirmation removed any comforting illusion that she might simply have stepped away or become lost without injury. It tied the violence of the scene directly to her. That same day, the FBI announced a reward of up to $50,000 for information leading to Nancy's recovery or the arrest and conviction of anyone involved. Later, the FBI's wanted poster would be updated to show a reward of up to $100,000. Rewards do not solve cases by themselves, but they do signal priority. And in Nancy Guthrie's case, the blood on the porch and the rising reward told the country the same thing. This was grave, urgent, and being treated as such. Search efforts expanded quickly and visibly. By February 1st, investigators were already using drones and dogs. In the days that followed, officers returned to Nancy's neighborhood again and again, searched desert terrain, and canvassed around the home of her daughter Annie, whom Nancy had visited hours before she vanished. Public reporting described teams walking among rocks and desert vegetation while agents knocked on doors in surrounding neighborhoods. The sheer amount of ground being covered said something important about the case. Investigators were not working from a single obvious trail. They were working outward, trying to capture any possible route, dump site, witness point, or camera angle that could preserve one surviving clue. In the desert, distance can swallow evidence quickly. Every hour mattered, and every house within sight of a road or wash line could potentially hold a missing fragment of the timeline. By February 12th, investigators widened their public request in a striking way. They asked residents within a 2-mile radius of Nancy's home to share security footage and report any suspicious activity they had noticed in the month before she disappeared. That request is important, not because it proves anything specific, but because it shows how investigators were thinking. They were not looking only at the night of February 1st. They were looking backward. They wanted the wider pattern. They wanted footage from days before, maybe weeks before. They wanted neighbors to rerun their memory and their camera feeds for anything that had seemed too small to matter at the time. In a case with very few confirmed public clues, that request suggested the possibility that the abduction did not begin when Nancy vanished. It may have begun earlier, in preparation, observation, or trial movements that only made sense in hindsight. Then came the images that changed the case. On February 10th, the FBI said it had managed to recover previously inaccessible doorbell camera footage showing what it described as an armed individual appearing to tamper with the camera at Nancy Guthrie's front door. The images had not been available at first because investigators initially said Nancy did not have an active cloud subscription and there was no accessible video. But digital forensics experts and private sector partners kept working and eventually recovered data from back-end systems. That development matters because it transformed the investigation from abstraction to image. Up to that point, the public had a timeline, a bloodstain, and a family's fear. Now there was a figure, not a name, not a clear face, and not an arrest, but a human form standing where Nancy's safety ended. What the recovered footage showed was deeply unsettling. According to the public timeline and subsequent reporting, the person wore a backpack and balaclava and appeared to try to cover the camera with a gloved hand before ripping out a plant from the yard to block the camera's view. The FBI described the person as armed. The wanted poster later said the images showed an armed individual appearing to have tampered with the camera at Nancy's front door on the morning of her disappearance. That detail became central because it tied the figure directly to the house itself, not to some distant rumor or secondhand sighting. This was not a vague report of a suspicious person in the neighborhood. This was a masked figure on Nancy Guthrie's porch, interacting with the camera at the entry point to her home, in the same overnight window in which she vanished. The release of those images changed the emotional center of the case. Before February 10th, people were reacting to absence. After February 10th, they were reacting to presence. A body on the porch, a backpack, gloves, a mask, an arm stretching toward the camera. In many investigations, surveillance footage can clarify everything within minutes. Here, it did something more complicated. It gave the public its first concrete image of the person investigators wanted help identifying, but it did not bring immediate clarity. The face was obscured. The clothing was generic enough to be common, but specific enough to become important. The footage was eerie, but not complete. It answered the question of whether someone had been at Nancy's front door. It did not answer who that person was or what happened after the camera's view was compromised. On the very same day the images were released, law enforcement detained a man during a traffic stop south of Tucson for questioning, then later released him. Authorities also searched a location in Rio Rico with FBI assistance. That quick cycle of hope and letdown reveals something about the investigative reality behind a case like this. A public image can create a surge of tips, and some of those tips will point to real people. Investigators have to move fast enough to test them, but careful enough not to overstate what they have. The man released that day was not publicly identified as the answer. He was another example of how a high-profile investigation can lurch between apparent breakthroughs and sudden reversals, all while the central question remains untouched. Where is Nancy Guthrie? 2 days after the footage was released, on February 12th, the FBI shared its first formal physical description of the suspect. According to the FBI poster, the suspect is described as a male, approximately 5'9" to 5'10", with an average build. In the video, he is wearing a black 25-liter Ozark Trail Hiker Pack backpack. The reward was also increased to up to $100,000 for information leading to Nancy's location or the arrest and conviction of anyone involved in her disappearance. This description mattered because it gave the public something more usable than a ghostly silhouette. Height range, build, backpack brand and model. In a case driven by fragments, each concrete detail became valuable, not because it solved the mystery by itself, but because it narrowed the search from an unknown shape to a person with identifiable attributes. 6. Even then, the description had limits. Authorities did not release a name. They did not publish a vehicle. They did not say they had tracked the person after he left the porch. And the most striking feature in the footage was not the suspect's face, but the gear he carried. The black Ozark Trail backpack quickly became one of the most discussed objects in the entire investigation because it was specific enough to be memorable and common enough to be difficult. A backpack sold broadly can be both a clue and a problem. It can help someone recognize a neighbor, coworker, or relative. It can also lead investigators into a flood of false positives. That is why the suspect description was so important and so frustrating at the same time. It gave the public a focal point, but not a full identity. 6. The public response was massive. Associated Press reporting said the Sheriff's Department received more than 4,000 calls within 24 hours after the porch footage was released. The FBI said it had collected more than 13,000 tips since February 1st, while the Sheriff's Department had taken at least 18,000 calls. NBC later reported that the number of leads being handled by the Sheriff's Office and FBI together had climbed into the tens of thousands. This is one of the paradoxes of modern investigations. A single image can generate overwhelming help and overwhelming noise at the same time. Every tip has to be assessed. Every claimed sighting has to be weighed. Every person who says, "I think I know that backpack," creates work. And in a case this public, investigators do not have the luxury of ignoring even weak leads, because one weak lead sometimes turns out to be the only real one. 7. The investigation also turned increasingly technical. Authorities and media reports described efforts to locate Nancy not just through canvases and interviews, but through the digital systems surrounding her life. Her pacemaker became one of those systems. Public reporting said investigators were trying advanced methods to detect signals tied to the device after the app disconnected from her phone at 2:28 a.m. That search underscored how urgent the case was. Nancy's pacemaker was not just a medical detail. It was one of the few electronic traces still connected to her body. When ordinary routes fail in a disappearance, investigators start asking whether technology can still hear what people cannot see. In this case, the answer was uncertain, but the fact that such efforts were pursued shows how wide the search had become and how few easy answers the case was offering. Another clue emerged on February 11th and, for a time, seemed promising. Investigators found a black glove about 2 miles from Nancy's home. The FBI said it appeared to match the gloves worn by the masked individual seen on the doorbell footage. In a case that had so little publicly available physical evidence tied to the suspect, that kind of recovery naturally drew attention. A glove, if connected to the person on the porch, could potentially carry DNA. It could tie movement away from the home to a location in the surrounding area. It could become one of the few objects that had touched the suspect's body directly. For several days, the glove looked like the kind of break investigators and the public were waiting for. Simple, tangible, and potentially testable. But in this case, even the strongest-looking clues had a way of collapsing under scrutiny. By February 17th, authorities said DNA from gloves found near Nancy Guthrie's home did not match any entries in CODIS, the national DNA database used to compare profiles from certain offenders and crime scenes. The sheriff's department said there had been no confirmed CODIS matches in the investigation. That result mattered, but it did not mean the DNA was useless. A lack of a CODIS hit can simply mean the person has never been entered into that system. It can also mean investigators have to look elsewhere, including genetic genealogy. Still, for the public, the announcement was sobering. The glove had seemed like a direct path toward identity, and instead it produced another barrier. The case once again moved from the edge of a possible answer back into the fog. 9. Then came the correction that made the glove even more instructive. On March 4th, CBS reported that the DNA on the black glove found roughly 2 miles from Nancy's home had been traced to a restaurant worker in the area who was not considered part of the investigation. In other words, the glove that had looked so significant at first turned out not to be the forensic pillar many had hoped it was. That does not make the early attention to it unreasonable. It makes it a lesson. In open cases, proximity can mislead. Similar appearance can mislead. Even real DNA can mislead when the object carrying it has nothing to do with the crime. The glove mattered not because it solved the case, but because it showed how carefully this evidence has to be handled. A case this public can turn a maybe into a myth overnight. The actual investigation cannot afford that mistake. As public attention intensified, so did speculation about Nancy's family. That speculation became strong enough that on February 16th, Sheriff Chris Nanos publicly stated that all members of the Guthrie family, including all siblings and their spouses, had been cleared as possible suspects. Reuters reported his statement that the family had been cooperative and gracious, and that suggesting otherwise was cruel. This is one of the most important facts to keep in view when looking at the case today. High-profile disappearances often generate suspicion close to home, especially when public information is limited. But law enforcement's public position was clear. The family, including spouses, had been cleared as possible suspects. Whatever unanswered questions remain in the investigation, that official statement is part of the documented record and cannot be brushed aside in favor of online theory. Savannah Guthrie addressed that atmosphere directly in her first television interview after her mother vanished. She said seeing the images of a masked man at Nancy's front door was terrifying, but that she was also glad the public saw what had come to the house after cruel speculation about family involvement began to spread. She spoke through tears about the possibility that her mother had been taken because of her public profile, while also making clear that the family still did not know why Nancy was taken. That interview matters because it returned the focus to the victim and the documented scene. An elderly woman was gone. Blood had been found at the porch. Doors were propped open. A masked man had appeared at the entrance. Whatever the case eventually proves, the family's public grief unfolded under a level of suspicion that law enforcement itself had already said was misplaced. 4. While the glove lead weakened, other forensic questions remained alive. CBS reported in late February that DNA recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's house might not provide enough material to yield a clean, usable profile, with one source describing it as low level. But that was not the end of the story. In April, ABC reported that the FBI had received potentially critical DNA recovered from Nancy's home, and that the sheriff's department had previously described that sample as coming from more than one person and needing to be untangled. Those two updates are easy to misread if taken separately. Together, they tell a more careful story. The DNA from the home may be important, but important evidence is not always simple evidence. It may exist, it may matter, and it may still take months of work before investigators know exactly what or whom it truly represents. 11. That is why investigators began talking about more advanced forensic options. CBS reported that authorities were considering genetic genealogy to make the most of the DNA evidence. ABC later reported that the FBI had received a hair sample collected from Nancy's home in February and was using new technology to conduct advanced analysis, while Sheriff Nanos said it could take months to separate and isolate what investigators needed. The public often imagines DNA as a magic key. In reality, it can be a maze. A profile may be partial. A sample may be mixed. A result may point only to distant relatives, not direct names. But in a case with so few publicly confirmed physical clues, even the possibility of a usable genetic trail remains significant. It is one of the few evidence paths that can still move forward even when human memory, camera angles, and immediate searches have failed. 11. Authorities have also been careful not to oversimplify the number of people who may be involved. ABC reported that investigators were not ruling out the possibility that more than one person may have participated in Nancy Guthrie's abduction. The same broader reporting around the case also indicated that investigators had not publicly associated a vehicle with the crime. Those two facts matter because they highlight how incomplete the public picture still is. There is a suspect image from the porch, but that does not automatically close the question of whether others helped plan, assist, transport, or conceal. There is a time window, but no publicly confirmed getaway route. There is a home crime scene, but not a publicly identified destination. When a case sits this long without a named suspect, even the absences become part of the evidence story. What investigators are not ruling out can be just as telling as what they are willing to confirm. 12. By late February, the investigation had grown so broad that an FBI official said agents had amassed as many as 10,000 hours of video connected to the case. NBC reported that collecting, reviewing, and analyzing video had become one of the key pieces of the investigation, and that each clip had to be watched in real time, with enhancement taking even longer. That image alone tells you what kind of case this became. Not one camera, not one neighborhood clip. 10,000 hours. The public sees a few seconds from a porch. Investigators see a sea of digital possibilities stretching across roads, homes, businesses, and intersections, all of it needing to be tested against a narrow overnight window. This is the grind behind the mystery. Long after the first wave of headlines, someone still has to sit with the footage and look for movement, timing, direction, and one small inconsistency that could break the case open. 13. And then there is the date that lingers at the edge of the story. In a March 22 family statement cited in the Associated Press timeline, Savannah Guthrie urged the public to think back not only to January 31st and February 1st, but also to the evening of January 11th. She asked people to consult camera footage, journal notes, text messages, observations, or conversations that might, in retrospect, hold significance. That appeal is worth noting because it widens the frame without pretending to explain it. Publicly, authorities have not laid out every reason behind every date that matters to them. But when a family asks people to revisit an earlier evening in addition to the night Nancy vanished, it suggests that investigators and loved ones alike believe the story may extend beyond a single set of overnight timestamps. Sometimes the clearest sign that a case is larger than it first appears is the date no one can easily explain yet. 1. As of May 7, 2026, Nancy Guthrie still appears on the FBI Phoenix Field Office's Wanted and Missing Persons pages, and the Bureau's poster continues to offer up to $100,000 for information leading to her location or the arrest and conviction of anyone involved in her disappearance. Public reporting also shows that the family's separate $1 million reward remains part of the case. Nancy has not been publicly found. No suspect has been publicly named. And despite months of searches, tips, forensic work, and recovered footage, the core of the case remains painfully intact. An elderly woman returned home from dinner on January 31st, and by the next day she was gone under circumstances authorities say indicate she was taken against her will. 14. So this is where part 1 leaves us. Not with a solved mystery, and not with a reckless guess, but with the hard outline of what the documented record actually shows. An 84-year-old vulnerable woman returns home from dinner. In the early hours of February 4, her doorbell camera disconnects, motion is detected, and her pacemaker app loses contact with her phone. Later that morning, family finds a home with signs that something violent and abnormal has happened. Blood on the porch is confirmed to be Nancy's. A masked, armed figure appears in recovered footage at the front door. A glove first seems important, then is ruled out. The family is publicly cleared. The DNA from the home remains unresolved. And the case is still open. If you want part 2, where we follow the surviving evidence trail even deeper, like this video and subscribe to Time in Crime. The image looked like a breakthrough. A masked figure on Nancy Guthrie's porch, a gloved hand reaching toward the camera, a backpack, a holster, a body where there should have been none. For the public, that was the moment the case seemed to snap into focus. But for investigators, that image did something more complicated. It confirmed that someone had been at Nancy Guthrie's front door in the narrow overnight window when she disappeared, and at the same time, it exposed how little was actually known beyond that. The figure had shape but no name, movement but no face, proximity but no clear path in or out. And that is where part 2 of this case really begins, because the deeper investigators dug, the more the evidence divided into 2 categories: the clues that felt important and the clues that could actually withstand scrutiny. If you value careful, evidence-based storytelling that stays grounded in what can be documented, like this video and subscribe to Time in Crime. In a case this public, it is easy to mistake noise for progress. The goal here is the opposite: to follow the verified record, separate strong leads from dead ends, and understand why a case can remain unsolved even when the entire country feels like it has already seen the suspect. Officially, the public description of the man on the porch has always been narrower than the internet conversation around him. The FBI says the suspect seen in the recovered footage is a male, approximately 5'9" to 5'10", with an average build, wearing a black 25-liter Ozark Trail Hiker Pack backpack. The Bureau has described the footage as showing an armed individual appearing to tamper with the camera at Nancy Guthrie's front door on the morning of her disappearance, and the FBI has continued to seek help identifying that individual. That matters because it sets the limit of what law enforcement has actually confirmed. The official description is physical, not personal. It gives height, build, and gear. It does not give a name, a motive, or a relationship to Nancy Guthrie. And in a case where public suspicion has repeatedly outrun the evidence, that distinction matters. The reason that distinction matters even more is that the original porch images remain, in public terms, the strongest visual clue investigators have. In March, NBC reported that additional footage recovered from other surveillance cameras on Nancy Guthrie's property did not show new suspicious activity and did not capture the suspect previously seen on the doorbell video. According to 2 people briefed on the matter, the figure on the front camera does not appear in any of the newly recovered footage. That means the first images that shocked the country are still the only known images authorities publicly have of the suspect. More cameras did not produce more certainty. More recovered footage did not reveal where the person came from, where the person went, or what happened after the camera's view was compromised. In practical terms, the most recognizable evidence in the entire case may also be the most isolated. 2. That isolation is part of why the timeline after February 1st has expanded backward instead of forward. On February 12th, investigators asked residents within a 2-mile radius of Nancy Guthrie's home to share any security footage showing suspicious people or vehicles from the month before she disappeared. That request was not limited to the abduction night. It specifically reached back to the beginning of January. Later reporting said investigators also asked some neighbors about video from particular dates, including January 11th, and on March 22nd, the family publicly urged people to think back not only to January 31st and February 1st, but also to the evening of January 11th, asking them to revisit camera footage, text messages, notes, and conversations that might look different in hindsight. That is one of the clearest signs that the investigation may involve preparation or prior activity that the public still does not fully understand. But the important word there is may. Authorities have not publicly explained why those dates matter. They have only signaled that they do. 3. That same caution applies to one of the most discussed details in the case: whether all of the widely circulated images from Nancy Guthrie's porch were captured on the same night. NBC reported in February that 2 law enforcement sources familiar with the investigation said one of the images of the man at Nancy's front door may have been taken earlier than the morning she disappeared. But Sheriff Chris Nanos publicly pushed back, saying there was no date or timestamp associated with that image and that any suggestion it came from a different day was speculative. So the public record does not let us treat that question as settled. It leaves us in an uncomfortable but familiar place. One source-based report suggesting the timeline may be wider than it looks, and the sheriff warning that the evidence available publicly does not prove that yet. In other words, even the photos that seem to clarify the case introduced another layer of uncertainty. The same pattern appears when you follow the search away from Nancy's porch and into the surrounding neighborhood. In early March, attention turned to Ring camera footage captured about 2.5 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, showing a vehicle passing at approximately 2:36 a.m. on February 1st. That timestamp immediately drew notice because Nancy's pacemaker app had disconnected from her phone at 2:28 a.m., according to the official timeline. The gap is short enough to feel meaningful, and that is exactly why the vehicle clip became such a compelling lead. But the public record here is more restrained than the online discussion around it. NBC reported that Sheriff Nanos said investigators were aware of the footage and looking into it, but that authorities had not identified the vehicle. NBC also said it had not independently verified the video. So the vehicle is real as a lead, not as an answer. It is a possible thread, not a confirmed getaway car. Frank, that vehicle matters for another reason too. Publicly, investigators still have not identified a suspect's vehicle in this case. So when a clip surfaces within that time window, on a road near the neighborhood, it naturally becomes important. But important does not mean conclusive. Sheriff Nanos said investigators were looking at that car along with countless other vehicles that were out driving at that hour. That is the investigative reality most people never see. A case like this does not move in a straight line from clue to arrest. It widens. One image leads to hundreds of tips. One possible vehicle leads to many more vehicles. A clip that looks precise to the public becomes one item in a much larger pool of movement, traffic, timing, and elimination. And until a vehicle is identified, linked, and placed in a defensible timeline, it remains what it is now, a lead under review. Frank, if the visual evidence has remained frustratingly limited, the scale of the investigative effort has not. By late February, an FBI official said the Bureau had amassed as many as 10,000 hours of video in the Nancy Guthrie investigation. NBC reported that collection, review, and analysis of video had become one of the key parts of the case, and that every clip has to be watched in real time, with enhancement and slowing only adding more hours. That number is worth sitting with, because it changes the way the case looks from the inside. The public sees a few seconds from a porch. Investigators see a digital landscape spread across homes, streets, intersections, businesses, and private cameras, all of it needing to be checked against a narrow overnight window. The work is massive, repetitive, and slow. And in cases built on a small number of decisive minutes, that kind of patience is not optional. It is the only way to avoid mistaking coincidence for evidence. 6. For all that effort, one of the most widely discussed physical clues in the case ultimately became a warning about how deceptive early evidence can be. In mid-February, authorities said DNA from gloves found a few miles from Nancy Guthrie's home produced no hits in CODIS, the national DNA database. At that stage, the glove appeared promising enough to attract national attention. It was near the search area, it seemed similar to the gloves seen in the porch footage, and it carried a male DNA profile. But by March 4th, CBS reported that the glove had been traced to a restaurant worker in the area who had nothing to do with the case. ABC also reported that the glove DNA did not match the DNA recovered from Nancy Guthrie's property. That reversal matters because it shows how dangerous it is to build a theory around an item before investigators have closed the loop. The glove was not meaningless. It was informative. It revealed how easily a nearby object can look like the key to a case and still have no connection to the crime at all. 7. Once the glove fell away, the center of gravity in the case shifted back to the evidence found inside Nancy Guthrie's home. And that evidence has been both promising and stubborn. CBS reported in late February that there were concerns the DNA recovered from inside the home might not yield a usable profile, with one source describing it as low level. Then in April, ABC reported that the FBI had recently received and begun analyzing potentially critical DNA recovered from Nancy's home, including a hair sample collected in February. ABC also reported that the Sheriff's Department had previously described the DNA from the home as a sample that came from more than one person and had to be untangled. That combination explains why this path has taken so long. The question is not simply whether DNA exists. The question is whether it can be separated, interpreted, and turned into something that identifies a person, rather than just proving that biological material was present. That is a much slower, harder process than television has taught most people to expect. 8. And yet, even with those complications, investigators have continued to treat the home DNA as one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. ABC reported that the FBI is using advanced analysis on the DNA sample from Nancy Guthrie's home, and that Sheriff Nanos had told a neighborhood watch group it could take months to isolate what investigators need. NBC also reported in early March that authorities were still having challenges processing mixed DNA found at Nancy's property, though Nanos said he still believed it could become a viable lead. ABC further reported that investigators were looking into additional investigative genetic genealogy options, which can identify an unknown person through relatives who have voluntarily submitted DNA to genealogy databases. That is not a shortcut, and it is not a guarantee. But it is one of the few evidence paths that can continue advancing even when witnesses have nothing more to give and video yields only fragments. In a case where the suspect's face remains hidden, the biological trail may still prove more revealing than the visual one. Publicly, authorities have also left room for the possibility that more than one person may have been involved, while stopping far short of endorsing any specific theory. ABC reported in February that the sheriff's office was not ruling out more than one suspect. That is a meaningful statement, but it is also a limited one. It does not prove a team. It does not establish roles. It does not identify who may have helped, if anyone did. It only means investigators had not narrowed the case down to one confirmed offender. In a responsible telling of this case, that distinction matters. The investigation has room for complexity. But room for complexity is not proof of a hidden structure. That is one of the most important boundaries in the Nancy Guthrie case, what law enforcement has left open, and what the public has rushed to fill in for itself. Then, if there is one place where the public record becomes especially emotional, it is in the gap between the family's pleas and the uncertainty around the ransom communications. By February 9th, the FBI said it was not aware of ongoing communication between Nancy Guthrie's family and any suspected kidnappers, despite a deadline that had entered public discussion. Later, in the April Associated Press timeline built from the case history, Savannah Guthrie clarified that some of the purported ransom notes had been fake, though she believed the two that she and her siblings responded to were real. That detail captures the cruelty of the information environment surrounding the case. The family was not just trying to find Nancy. They were also being forced to judge whether messages coming into the case were genuine, manipulative, or entirely false. Every communication carried hope and danger at the same time. And because investigators never had clear proof of life, even the messages that felt most significant remained haunted by uncertainty. 11. That uncertainty makes Savannah Guthrie's first television interview after her mother's disappearance especially important. In March, she said that the back doors at Nancy's home had been found propped open, while Nancy's phone and purse were still inside. She also referred to blood on the front doorstep and a camera that had been yanked off. The family, she said, knew immediately that this was not a case of Nancy wandering away, given Nancy's pain and physical condition. That interview did not solve the case, but it sharpened the public's understanding of what the family saw when they arrived. The house did not look as if Nancy had simply stepped out. It looked interrupted. It looked wrong. And because these details came directly from Savannah after weeks of silence and public scrutiny, they carried unusual weight. They brought the story back to the victim, back to the home, and back to the physical signs that made the family fear the worst from the very beginning. At the same time, law enforcement has been explicit about one point that should never be lost in the noise. The Guthrie family, including all siblings and spouses, were publicly cleared as possible suspects by Sheriff Chris Nanos on February 16th. Reuters reported that Nanos also said no proof of life had surfaced, but there was no proof of death either, and that his working presumption remained that Nancy Guthrie was alive. Those two facts sit beside each other in a painful way. The family was cleared, yet the case remained unsolved. Hope was still being held open, yet no proof had arrived to justify it. That combination helps explain why the case has remained so emotionally charged. It is not just open. It is suspended between opposing realities, evidence of abduction, absence of resolution, and a family still forced to live in the space between possibility and fear. The absence of a public suspect has only heightened that tension. Early in the case, the FBI said it had not identified any suspects or persons of interest. And that remained the public posture even as the porch footage, searches, and forensic testing drew national attention. As of today, Nancy Guthrie still appears on the FBI Phoenix Field Office's Wanted and Missing Persons page, and the Bureau's public materials continue to seek information about her disappearance and the identity of the man seen tampering with the camera. That means the case is still in the phase most frustrating to families and most fertile for rumor. A phase where the public can see some of the evidence, but cannot see what investigators believe it means. When a case stays in that posture for weeks and then months, theories rush in to fill the silence. But the documented record remains blunt. No public arrest, no public charge, no public identification of the person on the porch. 11. And still, the investigation has never looked small. The public saw officers walking the desert terrain near Nancy's home and near the neighborhood of her daughter Annie, where Nancy had spent time hours before she vanished. Investigators expanded canvases, examined cameras, tracked down digital evidence, and kept asking for more video. AP reported that several hundred detectives and agents had been assigned to the investigation as it expanded in the area. NBC reported that a dedicated team from the sheriff's homicide unit was working with the FBI. ABC reported that roughly 24 Pima County and FBI investigators were still actively working the case in April, while multiple labs were involved in forensic processing. When people say a case has gone cold, they usually mean the headlines have cooled. That is not always the same thing as the investigation stopping. In Nancy Guthrie's case, the public quiet that followed the first surge of coverage did not mean the case had ended. It meant the work had moved deeper underground, into labs, evidence review, and slow elimination. 3. By late February, Savannah Guthrie and her family added another measure of urgency by offering a $1 million reward for Nancy's recovery, while the FBI's reward stood at up to $100,000 for information leading to Nancy's location or the arrest and conviction of anyone involved. In their March 22 public statement, the family also acknowledged something almost impossible for loved ones to say out loud: Nancy might not be alive. But even that statement did not surrender hope. It asked people to think back, recheck their memories, and revisit details that once seemed too ordinary to matter. That is one of the defining features of this case. The family's public appeals have not been framed as performances of certainty. They have sounded like people trying to hold two realities at once: the possibility of recovery and the fear that time has already taken too much. The absence of a public suspect has only heightened that tension. Early in the case, the FBI said it had not identified any suspects or persons of interest. And that remained the public posture even as the porch footage, searches, and forensic testing drew national attention. As of today, Nancy Guthrie still appears on the FBI Phoenix Field Office's Wanted and Missing Persons page, and the Bureau's public materials continue to seek information about her disappearance and the identity of the man seen tampering with the camera. That means the case is still in the phase most frustrating to families and most fertile for rumor. A phase where the public can see some of the evidence, but cannot see what investigators believe it means. When a case stays in that posture for weeks and then months, theories rush in to fill the silence. But the documented record remains blunt. No public arrest, no public charge, no public identification of the person on the porch. 11. And still, the investigation has never looked small. The public saw officers walking the desert terrain near Nancy's home and near the neighborhood of her daughter Annie, where Nancy had spent time hours before she vanished. Investigators expanded canvases, examined cameras, tracked down digital evidence, and kept asking for more video. AP reported that several hundred detectives and agents had been assigned to the investigation as it expanded in the area. NBC reported that a dedicated team from the sheriff's homicide unit was working with the FBI. ABC reported that roughly 24 Pima County and FBI investigators were still actively working the case in April while multiple labs were involved in forensic processing. When people say a case has gone cold, they usually mean the headlines have cooled. That is not always the same thing as the investigation stopping. In Nancy Guthrie's case, the public quiet that followed the first surge of coverage did not mean the case had ended. It meant the work had moved deeper underground, into labs, evidence review, and slow elimination. 3. By late February, Savannah Guthrie and her family added another measure of urgency by offering a $1 million reward for Nancy's recovery, while the FBI's reward stood at up to $100,000 for information leading to Nancy's location or the arrest and conviction of anyone involved. In their March 22 public statement, the family also acknowledged something almost impossible for loved ones to say out loud: Nancy might not be alive. But even that statement did not surrender hope. It asked people to think back, recheck their memories, and revisit details that once seemed too ordinary to matter. That is one of the defining features of this case. The family's public appeals have not been framed as performances of certainty. They have sounded like people trying to hold two realities at once: the possibility of recovery and the fear that time has already taken too much. And that is what makes this case so haunting. The public has seen enough to know that something deliberate happened. Investigators have gathered enough to know this is not a simple disappearance. But the clean line that connects the suspect, the route, the motive, and Nancy herself has not yet been shown in public. So Part 2 does not end with a name. It ends with the surviving evidence as it actually exists. One masked figure on a porch, one home that still holds unresolved DNA, one possible vehicle that has not been identified, one family appeal reaching back to dates the public still does not fully understand, and one open FBI listing that says the search is not over. If you want Part 3, where we build the most careful evidence map possible from the documented record and examine what investigators may still be waiting for, like this video and subscribe to Time in Crime.